I came into the field reading M.R. James, basically, and classic English ghost story writers, indeed the British Sheridan Le Fanu. A little while later discovered Lovecraft. At the age of 14, discovered an entire book by Lovecraft, including some of his very finest work, Colour Out of Space, for instance, and also some of his lesser stuff like Lurking Fear. But I read that in one day, and I decided this was what I wanted to do. I wanted to try and pay back some of the pleasure that this book had given me. And I think there's an even simpler answer to that perennial question of why do I write what I write? I think the simplest answer of all is I value the aesthetic experience of terror, which is not the same thing as just saying I like being scared, because a roller coaster will do that. But I actually value the craft and the prose and the style and the sense of form that goes into any really good supernatural horror story. And I've been trying to do that ever since. I mean, Lovecraft spent his whole life trying to perfect the form of the weird tale. I suppose in my own way, I've been trying to do that for 40 years.
Well, really, I sort of started writing from a very early age, from about the age of about 11, 12. I only really started seriously when I graduated, which was in 1984. And I just signed on the dole, basically just started writing. I was on the dole for 4 years because during that time I actually wrote quite seriously, started writing quite seriously. I was getting good feedback from magazines, from sort of editors and people like that. And in 1988 I decided to sort of go full time. What I did was I went on the Enterprise Allowance Scheme for a year. By this time I'd actually written 2 novels. I'd written one novel called The Winter Tree, which received a lot of good publicity. Not publicity, but good feedback rather from publishers, but wasn't quite good enough to get published. So I then embarked on the second book, which was Toady, which was the book I eventually sold as my first novel.
I've always been interested in writing about the dark side of life, probe into areas that maybe people feel uncomfortable about investigating. I've always been interested in aspects of death and what it means to people, what it means to people's lives.
First time that I really got involved in the reading of it, which I guess is what started me off as a writer, was at school when my English tutor, a fellow called Alan Jones, came up to me one evening after school. There was a book fair, and he said, "Yeah, Crowley, you like reading science fiction stuff, don't you?" So dutifully I said yes. And so he bought this book, which was The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, which he paid 3p for.
In terms of my writing, published writing, having written heaps of short stories and had them published over small press and so on, which I'm very grateful for because they gave me a foothold in the market. From there, other people then started to request stories, commission stories. John Ford in particular, with his Terror Tales book, and now, thankfully, it's a website which will be maintained. He gave me a lot of help in the early days. Although having said that, my first book, Recluse, I believe was out by then, which was published by Tangen. Sadly now no longer. And also, thanks to Tangen, I got my second book out, Demon. Demon is one of those books I would not forget about, but purely because Demon wasn't published in the way I wanted it to be published, in as much as I was asked to reduce it by some 30,000 words. So hopefully in the future the full version of that will be coming out. On from there, over the years, I've had published several anthologies, the latest being one from Cosmos Books in America, Through Dark Eyes, which comprises 18 of my stories, 12 of them published, 6 are very new. But the notable highlight in my career of horror, this sounds very egotistical, because I'm talking about my writing, was the book Heart of Shadows, which, based on Lord Byron and the Supernatural, which was written following the very kind assistance of many staff down at Newstead Abbey, Byron's home, which was published to great success.
Started off in the small presses, submitting the work to different places, different magazines. Had a lot of help from the editor, John B. Ford. He was the first person I sent a story to. Terror Tales, it was. The story was called The Cave of Lost Souls. It was a ghost story. I sort of work in different subgenres if I can, different kind of experimenting in different kind of genres like psychological ghost stories. I do a bit of surrealism, and that comes from kind of my background as a painter as well, because I spent a lot of time at art college. I never consciously kind of set out to become a horror writer. I kind of wound up in that situation by accident.
I began writing around 1994. Well, the need to write and to entertain and kind of to get something out of my system. Since then, I managed to establish my own groove in the UK small press.
I won the British Fantasy Award for White, the novella that Masters of Terror Press published, which was a real thrill and stunned, as well as a real surprise. It's probably the best moment of my writing career so far, because during the awards I was sitting at a table, Graham Joyce to my left, Peter Crowther to his left. All three of us were up for awards, and I think Graham and myself were up for the short story award as well. So lots of banter going on in the meal beforehand. None of us thought that the first three awards out would end up on that table. Luckily they did.
I'm now in my fourth year as a full-time writer, having started out in life as a police officer and then a journalist. I don't specialise in horror in my professional time. I write for several children's animation shows. I've written for The Bill, that's the British crime series, The Bill, and I have a cinematic movie currently in production, I suppose I could say, in pre-production.
I'm much more interested in the point of view of the criminal, and so I always write part of the book from the criminal's viewpoint, and quite often part of the book from the victim's viewpoint. With Shrouded, it's about necrophilia, basically because I was quite interested. Most of us want a live victim or a partner, a responsive partner, and obviously necrophilia is the antithesis of that.
Big influence in my early life was Doctor Who. That was the first thing that scared me as a kid, and the thing I sort of tend to sometimes go back to. Still really like it. I've written a couple of Doctor Who novels among all my horror stuff, which I'm sort of more well known for. From Doctor Who, I kind of moved on to like the Hammer movies, Appointment with Fear, as it was at the time, which was the kind of double bill horror films that were on in the 70s, I guess. And really then just kind of grew up with people like Stephen King and Ramsey and I suppose James Herbert, and also the sort of Pan and the Fontana anthologies, the ghost and horror anthologies, where you'd find a lot of the old masters like M.R. James, Robert Aikman.
First novel was Underground. It was a horror novel. It was something that I'd always read since I was a kid, and I wanted to write novels that, in a way, it was a desire to pay back the authors that I'd read as a child and keep the process going.
I've read the classics. I've read Jules Verne, H.G. Wells. I've read lots of comic books, DC's Mystery in Space, Strange Adventures, things like that. And I read The Illustrated Man and just couldn't believe it. Just couldn't believe the writing and the scope of ideas. And quickly read everything that Bradbury had written at the time and continued to read everything that Bradbury wrote and still do to this day, which has culminated recently in being asked to do the afterword for my money, the best book that I've ever read, which is Something Wicked This Way Comes, and so it's gone round full circle.
I've always enjoyed writing, right from the word go. Reading avidly from when I could first open my eyes, I think I must have popped out reading a book. But I've always had a leaning towards the darker side. the investigative side, the paranormal?
Well, people who have inspired me, literary people, I think the main one's got to be Clive Barker, because he works in so many different media. He's got the film stuff, he does the writing, he does plays, he does paintings, and I think that's kind of what I'd like to do. I'm inspired to do that, to work in lots of different media, photography, things like that. Also, people like James Herbert. I grew up kind of reading people like that in my teens. More kind of modern stuff, Stephen Laws. More recently, people like Christopher Fowler, Simon Clarke. Really, really impressed by a lot of Simon's books.
My main influence in fiction is probably William Hope Hodgson. I think he's the reason why I began writing. And of course, there's a whole host of other writers who used to work along the same lines as Hodgson, around the same era, such as Blackwood, Robert Chambers, and a little after that time, H.P. Lovecraft.
I suppose the book that got me into horror was The Rats. James Herbert's The Rats. I'd like to thank him very much. I read that when I was 9. For a 9-year-old to read something so graphic and so shocking and so different to the horror he'd seen published up until then was a real eye-opener.
I suppose I could list my influences. It would be like a who's who of horror writing, going back to the year dot, really. Outside the actual literary arena, I grew up like so many people of my generation did in the 1960s and early 1970s, watching Doctor Who, Quatermass, Appointment with Fear. I was only a youngster at the time, but was absolutely enthralled by some of the stuff that I was seeing.
To save his houses, I took the raged and abused child feels and put it into an adult male body, and basically to create a very sadistic serial killer. And save his houses because these people take the victim to a safe house and a place where they're disturbed. One of the things the FBI and so on will tell you, don't let yourself be taken to a safe place if you're attacked on the street or something like that. Fight there. When
the Enterprise Arms ran out, I just had the sort of first money coming through from Toady to keep going. And it's just carried on from there. I've now written, I think, about 7 or 8 horror novels. I can say a couple of Doctor Who novels, which the BBC asked me to do, which was good fun. And now I'm kind of moving in a slightly different direction in that my work is coming out as a psychological thrillers under the name J.M. Morris rather than Mark Morris.
Yeah, I've written 4 or 5 horror novels since then, and 3 dark fantasy novels, which are basically horror novels but with a different marketing term applied to them.
In the early 70s, started selling it to small presses. Then when we had, Nikki and I had started our family, 2 boys, I was busy working on computers, and for 15 years I didn't do anything. And went back into it, doing articles and interviews. I interviewed Harlan Ellison, Ray Bradbury, Robert B. Parker, Jonathan Carroll, people like that, crime, fantasy, horror and science fiction, all of which I like. And then, I don't know, just started writing stories. First one went into Nick Royal's Darklands, and second one went into Steve Jones's Dark Voices, or vice versa. And since then, over 100 professional sales, primarily in the States. And then, of course, Ascardi Gap, 16 anthologies, a couple of TV scripts, and hundreds of columns and reviews.
Echoes of darkness. That's what I like to call them. Because in the dark, you hear noises and the imagination takes over. Ideas fall freely. You attempt to put things on paper, first drafts. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Loads end up in the bin. When you strike that happy medium, you think, yeah, that's it, go with it. A lot of my stories, to quote Mick Sims of Enigmatic Press, they published Treading on the Past, and indeed they did the foreword for Through Dark Eyes. You have to read my stories. Yes, they have a beginning, a middle and an end, but sometimes the ending is left open to the reader. I prefer them to think.
I went through my early to mid-teens just reading King and Herbert and not really understanding there was any other horror out there. Late teens, I started discovering lots of other writers. Like, I think that's when Barker came on the scene. His books are pre-revolutionary, I think.
I grew up in Wigan, in Lancashire, which was throughout my childhood a kind of decayed remnant of the Industrial Revolution. So I spent a lot of my early days playing on slag heaps and railway sidings, in derelict factories, colliery washeries, without really realising what I was doing, without realising that that was part of another world. I mean, I didn't wallow in it and sit around and say, look at all this urban dereliction. It was just the world we grew up in. We weren't, myself and my friends, I mean, it wasn't as if we were particularly poverty-stricken. I had a great childhood. And it's only now, when all that's gone, that I've suddenly become aware that it really was a window of time looking into a different age. So a lot of my stories, particularly what you would call sort of ghost stories as opposed to horror stories, have a strong Victorian flavour, but a Victorian flavour with respect to the urban blight of that era rather than sitting rooms in country houses.
Noise Abatement is probably the most autobiographical of my books so far. I lived in a flat happily for several years in Edinburgh, and in The Neighbours from Hell moved in above, and they had a band, and they had indoor football, and they had baths that they left on which overflowed. They had a washing machine which they plugged in and went out, and the water just kept coming out and out and out. It went all through my flat to the flat below, and it was basically relentless, and I almost went mad, and I would lie there night after night listening to this beat, and I would think about killing them. Fucker, you've made me suffer for months and months and months. You've destroyed my health. You've destroyed my working life. Because if you're not safe in your own home, if as you approach your own home with this increasing dread, you have no right, home to home eventually, basically. And so I wrote Noise Abatement. So it's sort of a wish fulfillment novel. And basically, I killed them off on paper and sort of got it out of my system to a certain extent.
There's a couple of reasons, actually. It's partly because the horror market at the moment is doing really badly. It's been sort of in a bit of a trough for about the last 4 or 5 years now. And a lot of horror writers are finding it really hard to get published in this country, having contracts cancelled, or they're having at best, they're having their sort of advances really, really lowered. So what I did was I finished with Piatkus after sort of 10 years, and it was kind of came to a mutual end. And I set out to write a book called Fiddleback, which, when I was writing it, I just thought I would just sell it as another Mark Morris novel. And it was slightly different anyway, in that I kind of think it was a sort of strange mainstream book. It's like a mainstream book with sort of very ambiguous supernatural elements and strange surreal episodes in it. But when we actually came to sell it, my agent suggested we send it out under a pseudonym, because the horror market was doing so badly. She thought that people might just get it, see the name Mark Morris and think, oh, this is a horror writer, we're not buying any horror at the moment. And also because it was written from a female point of view, first person from a female point of view. And we didn't want to jeopardise possible sales and also possible interest from a female readership. So we sold it under the name J.M. Morris to Macmillan, and they decided to promote it and publish it as a psychological thriller.
What I'd like to do is, particularly in short stories, is tackle sort of part of the human question and tackle those elements of loss and change in the human condition. And if it happens to need a science fiction vehicle to carry it, or a horror vehicle to carry it, or a crime vehicle, or even a western, I'd love to write a western, then I'll do it. So I won't sit down and say I want to do this. And right at the moment, I'm doing a mainstream novel, which has taken ages because I've got involved in TV projects. But so that I'm hoping that should be finished in the next 3 or 4 months. And I will do things that sort of intrigue me and that I think that people will want to read.
I've tramped all over the place, visited many places to consider ideas, to find ideas. One notable one was a neglected graveyard, which is not far from where I live. And pacing through the bleak trees, the grey, mildewed ground, it brought to mind an idea which was originally initiated by a book on Chesterfield ghosts, which told of many, this was in the early 1900s, miners walking down a path to what was then a drift mine, and for some reason they suddenly stopped going that way and ended up going a roundabout route. It all came about. There was a female ghost haunting the graveyard. She was seen walking across the tops of walls like this. And when somebody tried to chase her, she just disappeared. My story is a smell of incense, and it relates this story probably a little earlier than the time that it occurred, but it's got the Gothic trappings and the age-old mysteries with which I like to imbue my tales.
Pete Crowder, I think, is a fantastic short story writer. He's, in a way, reading Pete's stuff has shown me that stories about soul as well as action, really. You write a short horror story, lots of action, lots of stuff going on. There's got to be a real soul and heart and feel to the story to make it work.
I don't think it would be true to say that I was in any way scarred by my upbringing in a post-industrial wasteland. That's probably been a bit hard on Wigan, actually, not saying that. I don't think I was scarred by it, but it certainly made an impression on me. A lot of my work does have, as I say, an atmosphere of urban decay.
Because most of my things tend to be set in America, I don't have that many local inspirations. But there is one that does stick in my mind. And we used to live not far from here, which is on South Drive, which is just about 500 yards up that way. And we used to have a Springer Spaniel. And every night around 7 o'clock, I used to walk the Springer Spaniel dutifully down here, down to the Stray, which is this green area at the bottom, which separates the town centre from the residential area. We came past this nursing home here. And all the windows were lit, but most of the windows, curtains were drawn, apart from this one window. So Molly and I were going wandering by, and suddenly there was this tapping. When I looked round, there was a little old lady standing at the window, tapping on it, trying to get my attention. And so we stopped and I looked at her, sort of trying to make out what she was saying. And she was mouthing something, trying really to get this message across to me. And I thought it must be to do with the weather. And I was thinking, yeah, it's awful weather, isn't it? But no, she was very insistent, trying to get this something across to me. And I was leaning over to say, what? And suddenly this woman in the white coat appears and sort of puts her hands around this little old lady and sort of wheels her, walks her off into the middle of the room, and just comes back and looks outside. I'm still standing there, wondering what's going on. And this woman, the nurse, just drew the curtains, and that was it. And it kind of stuck in my memory. And even on the way back, I was thinking, there's got to be something that I can do with that. And indeed there was. And it became a story called Cleaning Up, which went into Nick Royal's Darklands collection, and then subsequently into my collection for Cemetery Dance, Longest Single Nail. So something comes out of walking dogs, but nothing much else has happened to me around Harrogate.
Older influences, Arthur Machen, his book The Hill of Dreams is probably my favourite novel, and any horror reader and writer should read it, I think.
I've always been particularly impressed by Arthur Machen's thoughts about the power of language and language itself as a form of witchery. And there's a passage in particular in The Hill of Dreams, which is his masterpiece, which is called The Roman Chapter. And his character, Lucian Taylor, imagines himself in a kind of dream Roman town with taverns, marbled gardens, villas.
Yeah, he lived locally in Killeen, which is my favourite drinking port, and it was his favourite drinking port. So it's nice to go into pubs and think I'm sitting in a seat that Machen possibly used to sit in, drinking gin where he used to drink gin. That's a really nice feeling.
Horror is one of those words which can mean a lot of things. Its definition is visceral. It conjures all sorts of mean, bad things, blood, guts, all sorts of things. I prefer personally the word terror, in as much as it is not what you see, it's more what you don't see.
These days, I think it's almost impossible to get published as a straight horror author. There's no real enthusiasm in publishing companies or among booksellers for horror. I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that they don't really understand what horror is. They have an idea of what horror is. And that is something that's offensive and unpleasant.
Over the last few years, horror does seem to have taken a dip in Britain. But I think we've seen the revival already. I think I've been sort of uncannily lucky. I mean, perhaps I've done a deal with the devil, perhaps not even noticed it. But by all accounts, my career should have plunged into the abyss 2 or 3 years ago. But Hodder and Stoughton keep publishing, my horror novels. And really, I don't know why I'm sort of like bucking the trend. Sometimes wonder why, my work still appeals to readers and still sells, and it's still doing well enough for Hodder to say, oh, yes, please write another novel for us.
There was a perception that readers of horror wanted lots of gore. And in actual fact, he enjoyed a brief vogue, but it's not what the standard enthusiasts for horror literature want. What they want is quiet horror, supernatural horror, in which the psychological states of the protagonists of the stories are engaged in difficult struggles, which say more about the psyche than it does about the body. So I think good horror literature is not about the body being cut up at all. It's about the psyche being dissected.
Horror is actually quite life-affirming. Again, because it tends to shine a light on corners of life that you wouldn't go into.
A lot of horror writers lost their contracts with the big publishers, and a lot of bookshops stopped stocking horror. But I was lucky enough to book the trend, as I say, because I think some of the readers I've been winning have been science fiction readers, so that's I'd like to spread my appeal a little bit beyond the normal horror boundaries.
Sadly, the problems that we've seen with horror marketing over the years have had a profound effect on perception, not just by the public, by publishers themselves. And I'm fairly optimistic about the kind of stuff that's around. I look at some of my colleague writers here in Britain, and I think there are good writers getting published. Okay, some of our friends are not at the moment, but they will. It will come back again. We'll enjoy a revival. It might not be called horror. People will have to find their way into publishing their books under different titles. That doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, writers have to use genre and their ups and downs, the twos and fro's of publishing to try and achieve what they want to do, which is, after all, just finding an audience.
Talking about horror as a genre is probably a misnomer, because it covers any type of writing, really. Never fantasy horror, never probably a romantic horror if you wanted, horror western.
When I came into reading horror, which had been back in the early 50s, virtually nobody was publishing it. There was the occasional best-selling writer, Dennis Wheatley in particular, books like Dracula and so on, and there would be the occasional attempt to do a short story anthology, and every so often something would be published pretending that it was not a horror book, like, for instance, classically, The Haunting of Hill House. And it's kind of interesting that 50 years later, virtually the same thing is happening, that very little is published in the field officially. Quite a lot sneaks through without being packaged that way. Novels by Peter Ackroyd, books like, say, House of Leaves. And it's probably just about as difficult now as it was back then to sell yourself as a horror writer. I think you almost certainly have to do it as something else.
But whenever I go around the country and I do talks and readings, they always sell out. I get people turning up all the time, and they're really interested in that aspect of what horror is. It's almost a spiritual thing. So they want to probe into these different areas, these areas of what happens beyond death and what it all means. And that's what horror does. I think no other genre does to any degree.
Nail by the Heart was the first novel I wrote, which was supernatural horror. But the second one, Blood Crazy, could have been almost a science fiction novel. And then I said to my editor, I said, "Oh, this one we could actually market it as science fiction, couldn't we?" They said, "No, the first novel you wrote was horror, so this is going to be horror." Which I'm glad he didn't market it that way.
I'm not too depressed about the state of horror at all, because, as I say, when I look at the movie industry and I look at the fringes of the publishing industry, I think it's quite healthy.
Horror's thriving in America with independent press. So people like Cemetery Dance and Subterranean and Nightshade putting out lots of good stuff in limited editions and trade hardcovers and trade paperbacks sometimes as well. And in the mainstream in America, it's Leisure Books publishing. We've got the only dedicated horror line in the world at the moment, as I understand it, publishing 24 books a year in paperback, and now branched into hardcover. And they've kept horror up there in the mainstream through the slump of the last 10 years, really, 8 to 10 years. But in the UK, there's no dedicated horror line with any publisher.
One other thing occurs to me. I mean, I started my career being published by Arkham House in America, which I think it's fair to say is the most famous and the most prestigious publisher specifically devoted to fantasy, horror, and the occasional bit of science fiction. Now, they came from a small town out in the Midwest. I mean, they call it Salt City, but you wouldn't call it a city in Britain. Today in Britain, I'm published by PS Publishing. I mean, my latest novel, Darkest Part of the Woods, comes from them. This is a small publisher in Harrogate, and I'm strongly inclined to believe that they're going to be already are well on the way to being the British Arkham House and being a major force in the field. We need them.
I don't think there's as many small presses in England as there are in the States. I know there's me with PS Publishing, Darren Floyd with Razorblade Press, and now David Howe's doing his small press. But aside from that, there really isn't that many small presses, and the reason that that's a contributory factor, if not the factor, is because I don't think the mainstream publishers, with all their overheads and expenses, can afford to pump the money into beginning writers and mid-list writers as the American people can, as a small press can.
Well, the state of the horror industry today, I think it's it kind of goes in, it always goes in cycles. And I think at the moment it's gone into a bit of a lull in terms of sort of major publishers. You've just got the main people like James Herbert and Stephen King, who are kind of given the more attention than anybody else, really. And I think the small presses are kind of filling the gap in terms of horror fiction.
Began by establishing BJM Press in 1996, publishing 1 or 2 chapbooks. Various authors who I thought talented, mostly UK authors. This has graduated eventually into Rainfall Books, and we're taking things a little more seriously now.
And recently, Rainfall Records have now branched out into publishing books, as Rainfall Books, obviously. And that came about when John Ford got a contract for a book in America. Was going to be titled Dead Things in Darkness and Light, which I did a cover for. And for various reasons that didn't come out. We were messed around it. Publishers were sold to another publisher, and then they went bust. And in the end, the book didn't come out. So both John and I got so despondent, we thought we'd just do it ourselves.
I've got a very simple rule on the PS Publishing that I pick what I like. There's material that I like and authors that I like. And I wouldn't say anything bad about the authors that I don't approach, because I think it's wrong to be elitist about any kind of fiction and work, because what doesn't work for me works for other people, and they are in their millions sometimes.
My name is Ray Russell, and I'm not the Ray Russell who wrote Incubus and various things like that. So I signed myself R.B. Russell to make sure that I'm a different Ray Russell. I'm not often mistaken as the editor of Playboy, which is what he did as well, I think. I'm the founder of Tartarus Press, which I now run with my partner, Ros. We have been described as a supernatural small press, but basically we just publish things that we like, and I'm working on the theory that even if a book gets really bad reviews or doesn't sell very well, everyone hates it, I can at least say, well, I really like it, and I don't mind having 200 copies under my bed.
People are very faithful to the presses, and I think if they've read a book that they've enjoyed in, say, PS Publishing or Cemetery Dance Books or Subterranean Press, they'll tend to sort of buy another book by a completely different writer they've never heard of.
There's a lot of great writers coming up through the small presses and through kind of websites like Terror Tales and through publishers like BJM Press. And you've got Saru, and also Maynard Sims started off doing a magazine called Enigmatic Tales. They actually had their funding cut for that, so they've had to kind of take their books to America.
Terror Tales website is something what we're trying to utilise to promote UK small press writer, to bring about a community feel more than anything, to give people the start, first step up the ladder, which they're not going to find anywhere else at the moment, I'm afraid. There seems to be a great lack of publishers, of mainstream publishers, getting behind the new writer. And so we've stepped in, we're trying to push the new writer, to encourage them, to give them the start that they need and deserve.
And the latest release for Rainfall Records is a various artists compilation called Strange Eons, based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos. That first began to form as an idea when I was working on Sleep No More, which was going to be an album of fantasy-related songs. I wanted to mix together the small press underground and the music underground into one project, because they both got lots of similar ideas, and they're basically done by people at home, not much money, doing what they want to do rather than being pushed into doing what the masses want.
And it tends to be that most of the books do have a supernatural bias, some of them quite overtly so, and some not so much. So people do sometimes think or ask why on earth we're publishing certain things like the Louis de Bernier we recently published, because that doesn't appear to be supernatural. And the answer is purely that we were fans of Louis de Bernier. The same with the new Denton Welch book.
Small presses are going to be the saving grace, really, of the industry, whatever genre that industry is, because I think that they can afford to bring out people and let them find their feet where big publishers can't.
We've also established Terror Scribe Society. People throughout the country meeting up, socialising, networking together, making friends, making contacts, to help people not feel so alienated, even lonely in what they do. And plenty of support, and that other people are out there who share their interests, and to give them that push, which may just lead to something quite tremendous.
I've had one anthology published to date, Aftershocks, which was published by Ash Tree Press in Canada. Enemies at the Door is a follow-up anthology that will be coming out from Silver Salamander in Seattle. It seems strange to people who aren't in the know that people like me are having to get published in America. And that seems to be the way of it at the moment.
I think I've found that psychological crime and psychological horror, the terms more or less can be used interchangeably. I know that when I originally was saying Shrouded Out, I was saying just a dark novel, and I was saying it to horror and to crime publishers. But basically, we don't have a horror industry in this country anymore. So in the end, it was a crime publisher that picked it up and they marketed it as dark crime. And I also always emphasise the macabre side of things, because I don't want it to be confused with traditional crime.
I've never really tried to get a novel published. I've sat down and I've written novels, none to the extent that I'm happy to sort of send them out for consideration. But from what I hear, writing novels in the for the horror market is a bit of a no-no in Britain at the present time. Whether this will change in the near future or not, I don't know.
Stephen's Houses, I had the same difficult getting it taken on as I did getting Shrouded taken on. There was an agent looked at it and she said that it was too horrifying for most publishers to publish. Very similar thing with Shrouded. I was told that it was too horrifying for their crime lists and too intelligent for their horror lists, which doesn't say much about what publishers think of their horror fans, and which is actually completely wrong. I mean, most of the horror writers I know have first degrees and a lot of them have PhDs. But there's definitely a mindset amongst publishers. I think, oh, we've got these bikers who read this, and they're only going to be interested in the sort of the very basic supernatural story, and they're not prepared to look at anything more realistic.
Been a resurgence lately in horror films, so-called resurgence with films like Scream. Know What You Did Last Summer, and shouldn't name them, but I don't really think they're horror films. I think they're designed to shock and make people jump in their seats in the cinema, so they come out thinking, "Christ, I've seen a really scary horror film." They've actually seen a film designed just to do that, with people jumping out of cupboards and boo to the camera. And it does make you jump, it does scare you, but it doesn't scare you where it should do. It doesn't really get you inside.
There are two films above all which I saw in my mid-teens, 15 years old, which profoundly influenced the way I wrote then and probably still do. There was Last Year in Marienbad, which took apart the way that narrative is structured in the cinema in a way that I'd never seen before. Okay, these days it's been it's been subsumed into the way people make films, but back then, to edit from shot to shot, where you had no idea whether the next shot was going to be in the future, in the past, or possibly in a fantasy of either, was utterly radical, and it knocked me out. I found it tremendously disturbing and exciting, and I tried to construct prose a little bit in that way in some of my early stories, some of the stuff in Demons by Daylight. But there was another film above all, I think, a movie called Los Olvidados, which translates as The Forgotten. It was one of the first feature films by Buñuel, who went on to be the director of Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, Viridiana, and so forth. Los Olvidados is a film set in Mexico City in the 50s. It's about street kids. It's the bleakest film you'll ever see about life on the street. But it also has dream sequences and images of such kind of grotesquerie that it takes social comment and marries it to the surreal in a way that each illuminates the other. And it seems to me that film above all, the way that the fantastic illuminates social realism and the reverse, that I've just been trying to do that ever since, and maybe I'm starting to learn how to do it now.
Films that have affected me, The Haunting, the original version, not the remake. No special effects in the film. You don't see the ghosts, you don't see whatever's happening there. It's just, there's the sound, there's a reaction on the people's faces. And there's that real sense of claustrophobia that they're stuck in this house and something's going on, but they don't know what.
I've been influenced by movies as much as I have by books. I like film noir a lot. I like black and white horror movies. There's an old film called Night of the Demon, or Curse the Demon in America. And I think that's absolutely great what they did with the shadows and the light and the sound on that. It was great. It was an adaptation of M.R. James' short story, Casting the Runes. It's a brilliant movie.
One of the great horror films for me was Sophie's Choice. It really got to the nub of what scares you, and it's when you try to embrace a concept and your head can't go around it, that I think is when you're really into horror. A lot of people mistake horror for being just sort of vampires and werewolves and monsters and all the rest of it, and aliens and axe murders. But really the horror isn't them themselves, it's what they can do to you. So really the horror is about dying or about losing somebody. And I think Sophie's Choice, more eloquently than many books and certainly many movies, managed to capture that by this impossible choice this woman was put under.
Jacob's Ladder is another film that I thought was just fantastic and very frightening imagery in there. The Exorcist, and people would disagree with me, but Exorcist 3 I thought was very good. Often overlooked, I think, because Exorcist 2 was such a fucking diabolical nightmare that people tended not to bother with Exorcist 3, but it was a brilliantly scary film.
In terms of films, things that were influenced me, directors such as David Lynch is quite interesting. I think he mixes surrealism with, I think a lot of people wouldn't class it as horror, but I think things like Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet have a very horrific element to them. Certain scenes in Blue Velvet are very disturbing, and juxtaposition of images and things like that, especially things in like these early stuff like a Razorhead.
Glossa Nombre, the Nameless, I like very much. I mean, it's in a way, it heartened me to see how universal the material was, that they could transfer it to Spain and still keep it, well, certainly stay with the spirit of the novel. Obviously, they made a fair number of changes, not least in taking out the supernatural element, which is a surprising decision. But in a way, I always felt the supernatural in that book was, if you like, extraneous. I liked some of the scenes, but it seemed to be you could do without it and still have the basic theme, and so it proves in the film. But I like very much the way that he used real locations, very much in the way that the book did. I mean, the finale of the film takes place in a real abandoned motel, and apparently they found it pretty well as unnerving as it appears to be to the viewer. And I thought it was very, very much in the spirit of the book, and I was very pleased with it. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to the new movie. There's a second one from that studio now, Second Name, which is based on a novel called Pact of the Fathers, and that's, I hope, going to be with us very soon.
Lately, you've had Sixth Sense and The Others, which are two traditionally scary horror films, I think. They really affect the audience on a level where they should be affected by horror films, not just a superficial junk thing that they leave cinema and be thinking about it for a long time afterwards. It's not only the twists that do it, either, it's the psychological effect of it. I suppose these films inspire emotions.
Well, I'm working right now on another supernatural novel set in a bookstore called The Overnight. I'm maybe halfway through that, and that again is overtly supernatural. So after having done several books that had no fantastic element, I've decided that the hell with that. I'm going to return to what I love best, which is the supernatural horror novel.
I've actually written a couple of things under the name Mark Morris, but they're going to be sort of more. This is sort of supernatural stuff, horror stuff. But that's going to be sort of more small press and published in America and that sort of thing. I've just started a new J.M. Morris novel, which at the moment is called Nowhere Near an Angel, but that title may change. Again, it will certainly be marketed as a psychological thriller. It's this time it's a first person against from a male point of view. It's set in London, and it's set between kind of two time zones, and it's about something that happened in the past that kind of impacts on the present. And it's about sort of uncertainty and how the mind cheats, the memory cheats, and things like that.
The thing that I've got coming out from Cemetery Dance Books, which is it's a cycle of novellas called Forever Twilight, and it looks like being either a 4 or 5 book cycle, each one around 40,000 words. In movie terms, as Invasion of the Body Snatchers meets Assault on Precinct 13.
My first book, Recluse, is now optioned for film, which will hopefully take place in 2004. Plus the fact that the same agency has taken 8 of my stories for hopeful production on the Sci-Fi Channel. And indeed, they are now working on some more of my books, which I'm hastily trying to get rewritten in order that they can farm them out. The variations on the books are from psychological thrillers to, would you believe, a book on the story of Mary Queen of Scots, which is fiction and fact interwoven. Bess of Hardwick and South Wingfield Manor in Derbyshire, which was one of Mary's prisons. And from there, sort of fingers crossed, keep my feet on the ground, and hope for the best.
Terror Tales has just recently gone back into print. We're bringing the books out at the moment. Volume 2 is coming out very soon. Volume 1's doing very well at the moment. We've got people like Christopher Fowler, Steve Harris, Michael Marshall Smith in Volume 2. So it's come full circle, really, in a way. We've gone past the website and we're going back into the books now, the anthologies. Personally, I've just been working on a Hellraiser book to do with Clive Barker and the film that he made. And I've got a novel coming out that's been introduced by a best-selling author, hopefully, in the future, and another collection called Remote.
The next project for Rainfall Records is going to be a similar CD, along the same lines as Strange Eons, but this time based on Rob Chambers' King and Yellow mythos. It'll have the same basic song, poem. The idea for this came when Joe Pulver, after hearing the Storm Cloud, suggested he wouldn't mind hearing Melanie singing Basile's song. So I took that as a challenge, and I immediately wrote the song and we sent him a demo of that, and he really liked it. And then when I read his Nightmare's Disciple, there's a couple of chapters in there where one of the characters is looking through a record shop, and there's lots of invented CDs and bands, one of which is a King in Yellow. So I mentioned to Joe that I was thinking of doing a King in Yellow album, and he sent me about a 3 or 4 page, track by track, blow by blow, detailed listing of how he thought the King in Yellow album should go.
Well, Telled by the Dead is my latest collection of short stories, introduction by my great friend Poppy Z. Bright. In progress, we have Secret Stories, which is it's not supernatural. Maybe you could call it something like The Face That Must Die, retold in the style of The Count of 11. So it's a comic novel. And I've revived my column yet again, Ramsey Campbell probably. Now it's appearing in All Hallows, the journal of the Ghost Story Society. I very much hope it will raise many prickles in its readers and its subjects.
What I am intrigued and enjoying immensely is this. Well, it started out as a short story, and I've suggested to Tim Leben that maybe he'd like to turn it into a collaboration of sorts, and so he was up for it. And this is going to be called Into the Wild Green Yonder, and it started life as a short story called Caveat Emptor, but it's now 20,000 words, and we've again, it's one of those things where we've hardly cleared our throats. You know, imagine it as a concert where you are singing, and we really don't feel as if we've cleared our throats. 20,000 words. I'm delighted to say 15,000 of which are mine. So it won't be coming back onto my desk for a good few weeks. But it's a rather strange story about a man who goes into his garden one day and can't get out of it. And whenever he does try to get out of it, the distance between himself and the house extends exponentially against the movement that it makes. Another great thing is we have absolutely no idea of where it's going to go. So to be 20,000 words into a story where we don't know where it's going, or we don't know how it's going to be resolved, but it's just a very, very enjoyable project to work on. Tim's a great writer and it's been fun to work with. Very wacky.
Late last year, I won the same award again for naming of parts. 2 awards in 2 years, which is just fantastic. Never thought I'd get that far, really. I remember I saw Mike Marshall Smith winning an award for The Dark Land, I think. The first convention I went to, he picked up an award, and I watched him go and collect it. And I was thinking, oh, that's being there, isn't it? And then winning 2 myself is great. I was even more thrilled this year to see Pete win an award for PS Publishing. He's in a short time, he's really done some fantastic work with it.
Well, you'll find me now in the dog days of the British Fantasy Convention in 2003, feeling jaded, a little hungover, and nursing a pineapple juice, so no alcohol, load of books in the car, and a very old Bantam book by Frederick Brown in my pocket, so all things are good. Been an excellent couple of years for PS since we last talked. Lots of new projects on, lots of award nominations, and even now, with the help of the Arts Council, funding from the Arts Council, the prospect of a new fiction, digest-sized fiction magazine to be launched next spring, with a great lineup of both well-tried and established writers and new writers as well. So we are doing more and more full-size books, anthologies, collections and novels, while still keeping on with the novella line, which is how PS made its name. The downside is it's affected my own writing, but I'm slowly getting back into that.
Yeah, I got the sequel coming out to Naming of Parts, which is called Changing of Faces. That's out from PS Publishing. The novella I wrote with Simon, Exercising Angels, which is about the angels of Mon's myth in World War I, which we're quite pleased about. That's coming out from Earthling Publications in America. And next year I might turn prolific because I'm going part-time to write. So I've signed new deals with Leisure and Nightshade in America. should tie me over for a couple of years. That's pretty much it. A couple of film options that I can't really, no contract signed yet, but it's all getting quite exciting. Horror isn't dead; it's just moved to America, basically.
To me, true horror isn't about haunted churchyards and open graves and things like that. It's about what people do to each other. Child abuse, sex crime, serial killing, spree killers, and so on. And I think it's also about people turning away from that. In almost every instance of child abuse, you get one parent who's a passive parent who knows what's going on, doesn't do anything. Again, quite often it's the woman, and she wants a meal ticket and she wants a man to look after her, and she's willing to have her daughter beaten or buggered, basically, in order for her to have an easier life. So that to me is what horror is about. It's not about like supernatural forces. I don't believe that there's forces of good and forces of evil. I think the only spirits I believe in are in this glass.